We have done a number of chain lubricating videos over the years, but advice changes and so do products. And to be honest, I've seen people correctly lubricate their bike, but sometimes there are common mistakes that crop up that means they're not getting the best from their actions. So I'm going to go over those mistakes with you today so that hopefully you can avoid them in the future. Dry lube, and often all-weather lube, is largely wax-based. Now, the wax is what's lubricating your chain, but in order for it to be in a liquid form, it needs to be suspended in a liquid carrier. So the first mistake I see being made is people not shaking their lubricant, because if it's not mixed in, then you might just be applying carrier to your chain and none of the wax. The next mistake I see being made with dry lube is people applying it to the chain immediately before a bike ride. Now, the problem with this is that dry lube needs time to evaporate. As we discussed, the wax is suspended in a carrier, which means that once you apply it, it needs time for that carrier to evaporate and leave the wax behind. Now, if you go out and ride, then it means there's this liquid on your chain that may gather dust and therefore work against what your lube is trying to do in protecting your chain from that dust. Now, wet lube is often oil-based, and this will need a good shake when you apply it as well, but because it's oil-based, you won't have to wait for it to dry out when you apply it. So you can apply it and go straight away, and that's great. And also, wet lube being oil-based means it'll last a little longer than dry, and it will be highly water repellent as well, so it's great for foul weather. However, the common mistake I see being made with wet lube is people not paying attention to how often you need to clean your chain with this. Being oil-based, it will pick up dirt and grit and mud, and that can create a bit of a grinding paste in your drivetrain, which, if you don't clean it often enough, it will wear out your drivetrain sooner. So stay on top of cleaning your chain if you're using wet lube regularly, and don't over apply or apply onto dirty chains. I'll explain why in a minute. Chain lubing maintenance is really simple. All you have to do is clean your chain, lubricate it, and if it gets dirty, you repeat the process. But I see this mistake being made so often, and that is people lubricating onto a dirty chain. Now, the problem with this is that the lube should be protecting your chain from wearing out quickly, but if it's gathering dirt and dust and you're lubricating over that, you could be encapsulating that dirt and dust and creating a grinding paste that will wear out your drivetrain sooner than you had hoped. So what you need to do is make sure your chain is clean every time it gets dirty. And if you're buying a new chain, while it looks clean, it does actually still need cleaning before putting on your bike. The problem with a new chain is that it usually comes lined in factory grease, and this grease is really good at protecting the chain, but it's also really good at picking up dirt and grime. And the problem with that is that often a black gunk builds up on the chain and the drivetrain, and this will need a strong degreaser to remove it. So ideally, you want to degrease this chain before you put it on your bike so that you can use a high quality lubricant that can be removed by just using a bike cleaner. I think it's important to say that not all lube is made equally. There are different formulas and even different oils that are inside things like wet lube, and they will behave differently with dirt. So if you have a drivetrain that keeps creating that black gunk that we talked about earlier, chances are one of two things is happening here. You're not cleaning your bike often enough, or you have a poor quality lube that is picking up that dirt too easily. And perhaps it's a good idea to try something different when that lube runs out. Now, you don't need to be a total nerd like me and apply one tiny drop to one roller at a time, but it does help to do this method because it's only the rollers that we want to lubricate. Those are the moving parts. We don't need to lubricate the outside of the chain. Indeed, if you have lubricant on the outside of the chain, we should be removing that anyway so that it doesn't pick up dirt and dust along the way. Now, you can lubricate your chain and work the crank backwards in order to speed up the process, but don't keep going around and around because you'll just be wasting product on that chain. But if you were in a rush and you did use this method, give it a minute to let the lube sink into the rollers and then wipe off the excess, particularly from the outside plates, because otherwise you're just going to be gathering mud and dirt again. And also, you don't need to be using your lube to lubricate anything other than the chain. You don't need to lubricate the pulleys or the cassette or the chain ring for that matter. So let's finalize with the absolute best practice for lubricating your chain. First, you want to start with an absolutely clean chain to make sure there's no dirt on there already, ideally degreased if you have it. Then you need to find a point of reference on your chain. I like to use a quick link if I have one, and I'll circle that to the bottom of my bike. And what I will do is then get my lube, make sure it's really well shaken up, and then I will apply one drop to each individual roller and keep going along the chain until I meet that link again. And that way I will know that every single roller in that chain is lubricated. And then if I've used a dry lube, I will check the manufacturer's spec to find out how long it takes for that to dry. With PTs, their ideal advice is to apply the lube the night before and let it dry overnight. But if you have wet lube, chances are you can just get riding straight away. And the next thing I will do is to keep checking that chain to see if it needs any re-lubrication later along the way, or if it needs cleaning, because if it's dirty, clean it and repeat. Anyway, hopefully that has been useful to you, but let me know down in the comments below if you have any advice for our fellow GMBN Tech followers.